Welcome to Some Stutter Law, Newfoundland Labrador's first podcast about speaking differently. Some Stutter Law is a production of the Communication Collaborative and is in solidarity with the Newfoundland Labrador Stuttering Association. My name is Greg O'Grady. I am also a professional stutterer who specializes in covert stuttering. I introduce myself this way as a professional stutterer who specializes in covert stuttering to remind myself of my many yesteryears and attempts to camouflage or hide my stutter out of shame and humiliation. I desperately wanted to be accepted and approved and to gain access to fluent, able-bodied privileges. I am a person who stutters, and those privileges are not often mine. As host of Some Stutter Law, I proudly declare I stutter. Some Stutter Law is an innovative podcast because it's a sanctuary, a safe space where myths and stereotypes dissolve and stigmas fade away. Some Stutter Law message is about blocks. Blocks are anything that confines the limitless potential of those of us who dare to defy societal norms. Blocks that manifest as more than mere vocal hesitations. Blocks come in a kaleidoscope of challenges. They're not confined to language or communication. They expand to touch every facet of our lives, cultural, racial, ethnical, and health-related. Blocks don't discriminate. The ultimate block is often the attitudes of others, those unwarranted judgments and misguided expectations. It's the pressure to reshape ourselves, all to avoid the formidable barriers that stand before us. We've set forth on a mission to dismantle the very foundations of communicative blocks. We're sparking conversations that we hope will echo through time by amplifying understanding and compassion. Please visit our website at Some Stutter Law to listen to past episodes of our YouTube channel to watch our videos. On behalf of Some Stutter Law podcast team, we look forward to unblocking with you. If any of our Some Stutter Law conversations triggers any emotionally or psychologically upset, please let us know, and if you feel it's necessary, please contact the mental health crisis line in your area. Some Stutter Law warmly welcomes Helme A.N. Helme is challenged with a condition called Wilson's disease. Helme currently is based in rural Newfoundland, where he is born and raised. Helme has been studying linguistics off and on for 20 plus years and hopes to do an MA in linguistics, sometimes in the next few years, circumstances allowing. He works primarily in IT, but occasionally works in the music industry. His journey with speech difficulties started in his mid-20s. He started experiencing diffuse neuromuscular weakness and pain, as well as coordination difficulties. This included sporadic episodes of dysarthria, dysphasia, and even a few episodes of outright aphasia. He spent the better part of a decade bouncing from doctor to doctor without any real explanation as to what was causing his symptoms. It wasn't until he was in his mid-30s that he saw an internist who suggested he might have Wilson's disease. This physician was able to make a conclusive diagnosis, and he started treatment, which was highly successful. He is very fortunate in this regard. He recovered significantly better than most Wilson patients who exhibit symptoms as severe as his. Treatment for his condition has proven challenging since COVID, but he is still managing much better than he did prior to a proper diagnosis. With the specific regard to speech difficulties, he still experiences mild dysarthria, dysphasia from time to time, but usually only when he extremely fatigued. In sharing his personal journey today with Wilson's disease. Helme believes that by sharing his lived experiences will raise awareness, support others, and to encourage conversations about this disease. So again, Helme, welcome to Some Stutter Law.
Thank you.
Now, Helme, would you explain to our listeners what is Wilson's disease?
So Wilson's disease, well, okay, I'm trying to think where to start the story. Basically, it's a congenital condition. Basically, my body doesn't produce enough of the protein required to transport copper in my body. So my body can't filter copper out of food properly. So basically what happens, it can present a number of ways. Usually the primary physical manifestation is the copper accumulates in the liver and just isn't excreted from the body. Eventually the copper will saturate the liver to the point where it actually will break free from the liver and enter your bloodstream. From that point, it basically starts attacking your nervous system. You can get really, really different presentations. For some people, it presents hepatologically, so you get sort of like stomach sickness and things of that sort. Other people will present neurologically before they present hepatologically, and that was actually what happened with me. I had neurological symptoms a long time before there was any indication that there was something wrong with my liver. When it comes to how it affects the nervous system, it primarily attacks basically the parts of your brain closest to your spine and towards your midbrain. So typical symptoms would be like difficulty with coordination, muscle weakness, stiffness, what's called neuropathy, which is basically like sort of persistent tingling in your body, pain, extreme pain at times. But related to this, it also does very, very frequently affect people's ability to speak. So it doesn't necessarily attack the speech centers of your brain. So your comprehension is very rarely affected by Wilson's per se, but it often very deeply affects people's ability to produce speech in a comprehensible way. So, I mean, with me personally, I'm trying to, again, so it's one of those things where how do you start the story? What happened with me, I started presenting, I'd actually been sick for a while. I'd been going to doctors for about 2 years saying there was something wrong with me. And I remember getting up one morning. It was actually, I'd just gotten married. I think I was married maybe 2 months. And I just fell over. Just like, I couldn't stand. And so that day, I think it was a 13-hour stay at emergency while they were checking me for things like brain tumors, etc. I spent about the first year, 18 months, they were telling me this could be MS. As a matter of fact, before they recognized Wilson's disease as something separate, it used to be called pseudosclerosis. And they thought it might have been a form of MS because the symptomology can present quite similarly. It wasn't so much in my case, I presented a bit differently than MS typically does. They told me MS, they told me possibly ALS, because of how diffuse my symptoms were. Eventually, after maybe again about 18 months, they said, well, we can't really find anything. So you might have some extreme form of chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. And I mean, by that point, I was showing symptoms I was showing hepatological symptoms. My liver was misbehaving, I guess would be the way to put it. So that went on for years, and it got pretty bad. After about, again, probably 8 or 9 years, by that point, I was basically unable to leave the house. I could barely move. We were bringing in a nurse to give me health care at that point. I was very, very fortunate that I met the doctor I did. It was in Carbonear Hospital, not too far from here. And she suggested, basically she was like, there's something really, really wrong here with what you've been diagnosed with. Your symptoms are much more severe and they're not consistent. And she basically tested me for everything. And then she noticed that I had, my copper readings were off. And that eventually led to the Wilson's disease diagnosis. I'll talk a bit more specifically about my speech in a second, I guess. But I was very, very, and I want to make this clear too, like even just not just broadly speaking, because this obviously is a podcast about people that have communication difficulties. So I'm very fortunate in that my faculties of speech weren't permanently affected, and I'm very cognizant of that. But in general, my recovery was significantly better than most people that go, untreated as long as I did. And I mean, like I went in the space of about 4 months, I went from barely being able to get across the house without a cane or assistance to basically being able to amble about by myself. After about 8 months, I started running, and I got to the point where I could do 2 to 4 kilometers every morning running. So I'm extremely, extremely fortunate, and I feel very, very grateful that I recovered to the extent I did. So.
Helme, would you be able to elaborate a little bit about the treatment? What types of treatment do
Yes.
you get?
So the basic course, there's an initial course of treatment where they give you drugs that essentially suck the copper out of your body. And those they're not fun to take. They're old drugs. Well, there's an older drug. There's a newer drug that you can take. They're both horrendously expensive. So getting coverage for that was a lot of fun, let me tell you. Let's put this way, the cheaper one is about $5,000 a year for the treatment. The newer one is significantly more than that. In terms of, so basically there's that sort of initial treatment. What you do besides that is you adjust your diet so you avoid foods that are rich in copper, which is very interesting at times. And it's like one of the challenges actually is trying to maintain a nutritious diet while avoiding copper, because a lot of sort of very healthy foods have a fair bit of copper in them. So, and then I also take some medication that regulates my copper input. One of the sort of talking about some of the unintended effects of COVID, for example, is that I actually had a lot of difficulty getting that medication when COVID broke out, because one of the ingredients in that medication was also used in one of the initial treatments they had for COVID. So it was actually a bit of a challenge just getting like the full dosage of medicine I needed to manage my condition. So that was a little fun.
See. When you talk about this, this disease affecting your daily activities, would you be able to elaborate a little bit more about like where are you now in terms of your your daily your daily ability to do your daily activities?
So right now I'm in the like not fantastic but okay category, I would say. Like I had the initial treatment, and that was great. I was good for about 4 or 5 years, and then COVID happened, and so there was the issue of getting medication, one, and then there was the other issue of sort of to treat the condition there you do need to periodically adjust the medication you're taking and the doses, etc. And the way you figure that out is through sort of fairly frequent testing. And one of the issues with COVID was all the lab work got pushed back. And I mean, like there was one test that usually took about a week to come back that was taking 6 weeks when the lockdown first happened. So by the time we got the labs back, there was no way of knowing. So fairly recently, I had some progress, and I am okay these days. I'm not doing as well as I'd like. So I'm sort of limited in my productivity in terms of I might have to take a few days out of the week to just like not do stuff, just to sort of cope with some of the pain and the fatigue syndromes that I experience. And again, it's the sort of thing where I try and maintain some perspective about it, because again, even as much as difficult as things have been, maybe the last 3 years or so, I'm still doing significantly better than I was prior to a diagnosis, and so I try and keep that in perspective.
Mm-hmm. What causes the fatigue?
Well, there are two causes. One is again, if you're having hepatological symptoms, like if your liver is not functioning properly, that can sort of affect your metabolism on the whole. A lot of it is pain. So um, you can take medication that'll kind of help, but like I think the way I describe it is, if you've ever had like surgery or like a local anesthetic, and you get a needle or something like that, it's like it's not quite as bad as it would be without the anesthetic, but you're still like, your body still reacts like there's something being stuck in you, right? I don't know if this metaphor works very well. But it's
Mm-hmm.
sort of like you can numb the sort of sensation of pain itself, but the way your body reacts to being in pain doesn't really change a whole lot. Um, I think one of the things I haven't really mentioned is it can also cause sort of like cognitive problems. So like brain fog would be the informal term. So so you can sort of just get confused, maybe a bit more confused. And again, that doesn't happen a whole lot anymore per se, unless I'm really pushing myself or I'm extremely fatigued. In terms of like a practical example, and again, this isn't nearly as bad for me these days as it was before they figured out what was going on. But an example of one example would be like, if you're getting up in the morning and you decide you want to get yourself a glass of orange juice, right? Most people don't have to think about that sort of thing. Like, you can, instinctively where your fridge is, you know how to get the orange juice out, you know how to reach into the cupboard and get the glass, and you just, you can do it instinctively. Or even if you're sort of thinking about it, it's not a complex task for you. uh, like a full-blown Wilson's flare, what'll happen is I'll have to think individually about everything I'm doing and concentrate very, very specifically. Otherwise, I just lose all coordination. And it's like, it's literally like it was like there was a period where it's like I get up and I go to reach for the glass in the cupboard and I just fall over just because I just lose control of my body. Just because of that sort of like that ability to like do things instinctively and have your body react in ways you expect it to just kind of goes away. Again, I don't know how well I'm
Mm-hmm.
conveying this. It's
Oh, definitely. It's
yeah.
clear. It's clear.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Okay. So, Helmet, in terms of treatment now, like where are you now with with your daily activities in terms of do you have severe, I guess, uh, sort of do you digress at all, or are you maintaining because of the treatment? Are there any setbacks, I
Yeah, I
should
mean,
say?
like again, it's mostly right now. I'm in a state of like just again, I have so much experience dealing with it, so I know when not to push myself, and I know if I'm having sort of like a flare up, and I also know if I've done activity X, that means I need to sort of adjust my next few days. Um, so like one example would be like long drives. Yeah, can leave me with a lot of pain. So if I'm have to do that, like I'll plan around that sort of thing, and like I'll know a few days ahead of time. I'll sort of limit what I'm doing, and then a few days afterwards, I'll give myself a few days to rest. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of it is like, okay, there are things like live it. You need to do certain things in your life. You have responsibilities. So a lot of it is just understanding how to prioritize what your responsibilities are and how to manage um when and how you can get things done, and which can be frustrating. It can be very, very frustrating. And there again, it's maybe not so much these days because I'm sort of cognizant of what's going on, but like it's very hard not to wind up in this cycle where you're feeling down and you're not productive, and then you feel frustrated that you're not productive, so that anxiety like worsens your symptoms, right? Like just the anxiety, because this is one of the things, if anyone has had to deal with any kind of like sort of neurological condition, is like like stress will it's like sort of, I guess, however it affects a healthy person, it's like you're dealing with that times whatever. right? Like that
Mm-hmm.
effect is so much more amplified. And so like I think probably in terms of a lot of it is just figuring out ways of managing stress and managing anxiety. And also I think for me, like I'm the kind of person that I dislike doing anything halfway. I'm the kind of person like I really like committing to things, and I really like doing the best I can at everything. And I think probably the hardest part for me is sort of like giving myself permission to not be going at full blast all the time. I think that was one of the really hardest things for me was that idea of like, no, you do not need to be as productive as humanly possible, and you do not need to be like going full blast all the time. And that's and
Mm-hmm.
there are probably still days where I feel a lot of frustration about that. But ultimately, I think probably in general, it's probably a good idea to understand there are things you can change, and there are things in life that you have control over, and to focus on the things that you actually can deal with, and try not to spend so much energy thinking about and worrying about things that you ultimately can't. So
Mm-hmm. Mm. So, Helmer, do you have a strong support system like your family?
so
You
I'm
know.
I'm 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 very fortunate that I do have people in my life that have helped me a lot, and I've had a lot of support, especially from my family. So I have a brother who's been fantastic, who's um, has always been a very very strong advocate for me, and has really at times really stuck his neck out, and done a lot, and honestly sacrificed a lot to help me at various points. So I'm very very grateful. Um, in terms of, I mean, like, and sometimes it can be hard to maintain friendships with a chronic illness, and again, it's maybe a little bit less of an issue these days, but like, and I think it's not uncommon for people to feel uncomfortable, but it's also like, I mean, especially when my symptoms were very very severe. I mean, you just don't want to socialize, like and this is something that I really went through. It's like, if I am slurring and I am, having these sort of Parkinsonian episodes where I'm shaking and I can't move my body correctly, and I'm crippling around, and you, you know, it's hard to feel up to socializing, and it's also hard to like. I think this is something I really struggled with a lot, was like having people perceive you as, I guess, less, or I mean, it's not great terminology, but like, I don't know, pity, not wanting pity, and not
Mm-hmm.
wanting, it's sort of like, because what I think what it feels like sometimes is that you're being judged based on, I mean, again, this may not be the best way to put it, but you're being judged on like the worst thing about you and not the best thing about you. And it again, well, I think a lot of time when you have chronic illness, it can define so much of your life, and it can define so much of your relationship with people. And I, like, so I think that's a normal struggle for anyone. I think, in terms of like, again, some it gets back to what I was saying earlier, which is that occasionally, like, socializing, that's an energy management thing, and it's so some of managing my symptoms is saying, okay, I can't do this thing that I wanted to do with my friends, and again,
Mm-hmm.
it's the ability to say, okay, that's fine, and you can, this is my experience having dealt with this, for the better part, I guess it's almost 2 decades now, is you might have this anxiety or fear that you'll lose relationships if you don't maintain them rigorously or something. And my experience is that basically people that stick around are probably the friends that are worth having in your life, and people that
So
that
true. So true.
and again, it's not, and I don't even say that in terms of like they're bad people, or that, like, it's just, it kind of, it's the same thing. It's like everyone has only so much energy and so much bandwidth to deal with things, and some people, they just, again, either through lack of experience or because of other things happening in their life, they can't do that, and that's fine. Like, so I think, yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
It has things. Now, how has this disease now? Like, you were saying that you know you have some good days and bad bad days. Like how has it affected your work? Because you work in IT, and you also do some work in music. Now, what kind of music? I'm curious now.
Lately, I've been playing a lot of jazz, actually, especially
Oh,
gypsy
okay.
jazz. I've been really so. Well, it's a funny story because um, when I was recovering, because I didn't really be able to play for a very long time. Like, I mean, I would pick up a guitar, for example, maybe once every few months, and I could play for about 5 or 10 minutes before succumbing to extreme pain. So one of the I don't know if you've ever heard of a guitarist named by the name of Django Reinhardt. So he's kind of,
No,
so
sadly,
the
I haven't.
progenitor of the gypsy jazz genre by some accounts. Basically, what it was, he actually lost the usage of two of his fingers on his fretting hand. He was in a fire and it caused nerve damage. So he basically, if you heard him play, you would not think this man did not have the full use of his hand. He's complete virtuoso player. So one of the things he did, he basically created a new way of playing guitar with limited mobility in his hand. And so like that's probably I like the music anyway, but like it's probably at least some of when I was sort of going through occupational therapy and trying to find ways of adjusting to using my body again. Sort of like that technique, those techniques that he sort of pioneered were actually very, very helpful in terms of being able to play again and being able to play comfortably without a lot of pain. So um,
Mm,
yeah.
okay. So, like, does this disease have an effect on your
Oh
work?
yeah.
Because saying you work in
Yeah, no, I
IT.
mean, like, so again, it's like it's one of the most annoying things. Is like again, responsibilities and commitments can be a challenge if you have to tell someone like I need to be off for 2 or 3 days this week. So actually, what happened was I was actually in school. I was actually at MUN again. I was working actually on my way to a linguistics undergraduate degree when COVID happened and my symptoms worsened. Um, so the yeah, I mean, I guess the very very short version is it certainly affected work and my ability to get things done. I do work, but not as much as I would like. I guess would be the way I'd put it. Um, and again, it's part of that. Okay, this is as much as I can do right now, and hopefully, as things progress, I'll be able to do more.
Mm. Now, do you work from home, or is that a possible? Oh, you do. Okay, that's okay. Okay,
Um,
that helps
yeah,
some.
it does. Believe me.
Okay, like, do you consider Wilson's disease a disability, or is it just a semantics thing?
I think for some people it definitely is. Um, I mean, to put this in
Okay.
perspective, a lot of people can wind up permanently paraplegic, quadriplegic. It's not unusual for people to have their faculties of speech almost completely destroyed, like being absolutely averbal and permanently aphasic. So I'm not in that category. I mean, I mean, in terms of like, it certainly affects my life, and it certainly affects how much I can get done, and it certainly affects yeah, it's certainly been an obstacle. Let's put it that way for me. I don't know how comfortable I would say per se. It's like it's really not an extreme disability in the sense that I still have the ability to live my life, and I can sit here, with and have sort of full motion of my body and speak to you without too many difficulties right now, and so like you know again it gets back. I'm just extremely fortunate. Unfortunately, a lot of people with my condition just aren't as fortunate as I am still. So
Mm. Is is this disease still relatively still relatively unknown? Like, is it?
well, that's very interesting. No, there's a lot of so the underlying mechanism is understood. So they can check your genes for an abnormality. There's a specific gene they can look at and say there's an abnormality here. Um, it's a lot more complicated. I think so. The last literature I read about this is that they've identified about 300 different mutations that can lead to the condition. One of the biggest
Mm.
challenges I had getting a diagnosis is my mother's a Newfoundlander, my father is from the Middle East. Um, the variants you get in the Middle East are somewhat different from the variants Europeans get, and the symptomology is very different. Not very different, but can be different. Um, and so one of the things is the doctors here just don't have a whole lot of experience with other variants. And that's not just, I've encountered that in, say, Ontario, where the doctors just aren't. So, as a matter of fact, when I first got the diagnosis and I was reading literature about misdiagnoses, so like very, very frequently, people with my condition get misdiagnosed as having MS. And there's probably a very non-trivial amount of people that have been diagnosed as having MS that actually have Wilson's or something similar. But like I remember seeing two articles, and they were both case studies, and they were both about, one was about an African American boy, and the other one, I think it was an older, Afro Canadian in Ontario somewhere. And because again, the African variants have somewhat different symptomology, the doctors just weren't as familiar. I really think about the case about the boy. He was a teenager I think he was in Detroit, and because and it goes to show how unfortunate prejudice can be about these sorts of things. But they actually at one point diagnosed him with marijuana toxicity. Now, that is a
Mm.
thing, but the amount of pot you'd have to smoke to get marijuana toxicity and to give you the kinds of symptoms that someone with Wilson's disease experience, I mean, it's so that has been an interesting challenge at times. So as an example, like there's a symptom that a lot of doctors here are trained to look for, which is you can actually get, it's called a Kaiser-Fleischer ring. You actually get copper deposits in your eye that they can see, right? I never had it. And again, like that's not necessarily unusual for non-European versions of the condition. I mean, by and large, Wilson's is probably horrendously underdiagnosed. As I'm probably about so last I spoke to someone about this, I was one of like 8 or 9 people in all of Newfoundland that was diagnosed with the condition. Statistically
Mm.
speaking, there should be about twice as many that actually have 2 to 3 times as many people. So, as near as one can figure, the condition affects 1 in about 30,000 people, but typically in North America, it's only about 1 in 100,000 that get the diagnosis.
Mm.
Um, so again, there's probably when I tell anyone that if you're diagnosed with MS, it's worth your while to look and see that maybe you could have Wilson's disease, because it actually is. If it's caught early enough, at least, or caught under the right circumstances, it's generally much more treatable than MS. So,
Mm. You also mentioned that you experience at times, mild dysarthria and dysphasia. Do you want to explain what this? I'm sorry, I may be
dysarthria. You know what?
pronouncing this
This is
wrong.
like the evilest word in the English language. I swear. To give someone, no, I mean this. Like to give someone that is having speech difficulties a word like dysarthria to pronounce, which is hard
Mhm.
enough for like the most the acute of English speakers to say, is just like it's absolutely criminal. But yeah, so
Yeah. Yeah, the D's, the D's, to be honest with the D's in terms of targets, it is called a closer word. It's a popping sound, the D's. And this is one of my challenges here.
I actually this was pointed out to me by someone actually in an email yesterday, and I was like, oh, I felt bad actually. I meant to mention it. Having dysarthria and dysphasia right next to each other, because I know that that couldn't have been fun.
Oh, that's
Yeah, I
okay
know.
then. Yeah.
But if it makes you feel like dysarthria is hard for me to say, so it's like I don't think that's an easy word for anyone to say.
Mm.
So dysarthria refers to difficulty with articulatory muscles of speech. So basically, it's any kind of impairment, moving your mouth, moving your tongue, moving your lips, teeth, etc., in a way, to make language or spoken language. Um, it's a very, very frequent symptom of Wilson's disease. Dysphagia would refer to having difficulty with language processing, or at least, giving proper output. So that would be more like you can't think of a word, or you mix up words, or you're not saying certain words. That would be dysphasia. And of course, then you have aphasia, which is basically the inability to produce any speech.
Mm-hmm.
If you would like, I could maybe tell you what my experience with this is like, or was like, or how it started. Yeah.
Sure.
So, okay, going right back to the first few months again, when this is maybe a few months after that day when I couldn't get up. I mean, again, I'd seen doctors at that point, and again, they were telling me, we're not certain. You need to start preparing for things like MS and ALS. Maybe actually backing up to before my speech was affected. And I'll just kind of give you an idea what those early days were like before I really had any treatment at all. I woke up in the middle of the night one night, and it basically, if I had to describe it, it was like someone was taking a chainsaw and like driving it down from the back of my head into my spine, while someone was running like cattle prods, like electrified cattle prods, in through my eye sockets from the back. It was like I could not describe the pain. And again, that was probably like 12, 13 hours stay at the hospital while they're checking me for. It was actually, I distinctly remember getting like, them giving me Demerol, and the pain was so intense. Actually, the Demerol didn't get rid of it. I was actually still in a significant amount of pain after a Demerol injection. So that probably happened a few times. This led up to one morning, and I guess this would have maybe been the fall of 2008, I want to say. I think by that point they'd given me some drugs to help with the pain. Which, anyway, this one morning I get up and I can't talk. And I mean, like I'm sitting there, I'm opening my mouth, I'm trying everything I can just to say a word. And I must have sat there, I don't know how long. And I just like, I didn't know what I was going to do. So after maybe about 5 minutes, I've studied linguistics. So what I did after like the initial, like just sheer panic of that happened. And it's just like I'd opened my, like I just remember so vividly, I'd opened my mouth and it, like I couldn't even just form a, like, just even trying to like say sounds, like go like s or something, nothing. And so my wife at the time is a French Canadian, and so I said, okay, I'll try speaking French. So I start trying to speak French. Nothing. Okay, I'll try speaking Spanish. She doesn't speak Spanish, but French, okay, close. Maybe I can get. Nothing comes out. I finally try Arabic, which she didn't understand a word of, and again, I can't say anything. So she's like, okay, we need to take you to the hospital. Probably by the time we get to the point where I'm getting in the car, I think I was able to maybe say like one or two simple single syllable words. Sort of. They got me in the hospital. They triaged me. The one thing I distinctly remember is them saying, for whatever reason, but it stuck with me. They said he's not having a panic attack. I'm like, okay, well that's good. That eliminates one thing at least, right? And again, having the background in linguistics, I mean, I was, again, there was a CT scan. I was fully expecting them to say like, oh, we just found like a grape tomato sized tumor pushing in on the left side of your brain, right, or something. And telling about intersectional stories. One of the funnier things that happened was, again, this is 7-8 hours into it. I think it was actually when I was having the CT scan. The woman was under the impression that I didn't speak, that it wasn't that I couldn't speak English, which was like a bit of a fun. So she was doing that thing, when people think that you don't speak English, they talk louder and start doing lots of hand gestures. She was doing this with me, and I'm like, and I don't know how I broached it, but I said like something I'm not getting, like there's something, well, she said they told me you couldn't speak English, and I'm like, mate, my folk are from the Placentia Bay. Like I grew up, I grew up an hour outside of town. Like, um, and so I think after that, I mean, I might have had one or two episodes where I couldn't speak altogether, but mostly after that was mostly in terms of just not being able to fully form words, or like this sort of, if you can actually go on YouTube, for anyone that's interested, you can go on YouTube and just look up Wilson's disease, and they'll have examples of people with Wilson's disease, and it's a very, very distinct slur. And actually, that was one of the things that really confirmed, even before the lab results came back to confirm I had Wilson's, was actually hearing videos of YouTube, hearing videos on YouTube of people with Wilson's disease, because it's like it's a very, very distinctive way of slurring, and it's like this sort of like the linguistics term would be like super segmental thing, where it's like there's this really distinct intonation pattern that sort of happens. But again, it gets back to, with Wilson's, it gets back to the whole like neuromuscular dysfunction. So it's primarily, it's the dysarthria is primarily a result of you just not being able to move your muscles properly in the same way I gave earlier, the example of not being able to pick up a glass properly. It's sort of a similar difficulty, just specifically affecting, the muscles in your face. Dysphasia is also possible, again, because you sort of get this, you can get in sort of like these sort of fugue or states of confusion, where it's very difficult to sort of process information. And again, if I hadn't said this specifically, very frequently Wilson's attacks sort of sensory perception areas of your brain. And so that obviously, to speak and to sort of think about what you're saying and sort of interact with the world, that requires proper sensory input. If that's misfiring, that can also cause difficulties.
You mentioned in your bio is that whenever you get tired or fatigued, you experience dysarthria and dysphasia. How often do you experience?
It's pretty rare these days. Again, if I'm pushing myself a lot, if I'm under stress, that'll definitely be a factor. I want to say maybe like once a month, once every 2 months at this point. Again, unfortunately, troubles tend to come in threes, or whatever the expression is. So there's probably been periods where it's like it's been 2 or 3 times a week, just because of again, things happening in the world or in your life. Yeah, I mean, I can avoid it mostly because, again, I know like how to not push myself too much, or I'll know if
your limits, in other words.
I think that would be the best way. And again, it still happens. Like, we all have our limits, unfortunately, and we all our judgment isn't always sound. So,
Definitely. Helme, is there more supports needed for people that suffer with this disease in terms of government? Is there anything that the government needs to step up to in terms of providing additional support?
I don't know if specifically anything would be related specifically to Wilson's disease. Like a lot of our needs would be very similar to people with a broad range of neuromuscular conditions, or on the flip side of it, if you're talking like the underlying condition before you get into like the hepatic element, or like it's actually very similar to Irish disease in some respects, or hemochromatosis, which is fairly common in Newfoundland. I think in terms of if you ask me, okay, in an ideal world, what would be done? I think one of the big issues is like there needs to be more information about like how the disease can manifest and the kinds of symptoms people with Wilson's disease can have. I also think, I think this is more a generic thing. Maybe it's less a government thing, but like I've certainly experienced frustration where I'm telling doctors, I'm fairly certain that the symptom I'm experiencing, um, is not stress. Like it's a physical thing. And again, I have a lot of experience dealing with this. I know my own body pretty well at this point. And so that can be a little frustrating. Um, this might be a tangential point, but I always think of a conversation I had with a doctor. Well, actually, I'll tell you two kind of anecdotes. Um, one was, and again, this was maybe about the first like year, 18 months into experiencing really severe symptoms. I had a doctor very kind of bluntly tell me, uh, you probably don't have ALS because if you had ALS, you'd be dead or a paraplegic by now or quadriplegic by now. And it was like, so that was fun, but the sort of maybe a little bit more related to what your question. Um, I remember, so again, they were telling me for a long time, well, maybe your symptoms are psychosomatic, psychogenic. They use various terminology, and I had a doctor tell me something very early on that always stuck with me. And she said, if you are diagnosed with a psychological, psychosomatic, psychogenic neurological condition, or you're diagnosed with having psychosomatic neurological symptoms, there is a 50% chance in the next 10 years that you will be diagnosed with an organic neurological condition. And that was, again, about 10 years before I actually got the Wilson's diagnosis. Um, and, it's kind of one of those things where you can lie with facts, because what that should be said as, it's one way of describing it, but maybe perhaps a more accurate way of saying is 50% of the time, doctors misinterpret, early signs of an organic neurological condition as being psychosomatic or being psychogenic. So I feel like I might have gotten a little bit away from your initial question there.
Oh no,
Um,
no, no. That's
but
fine.
I
Definitely,
mean,
yeah.
maybe to answer it a bit more directly, I think what would help a lot is more awareness about the condition, and certainly maybe doctors being more familiar with the very that there are variants to the condition that aren't
Hmm.
typical, and um, some way of disseminating that information I think would be very, very helpful for a lot of people.
Mm. You know, do you know if there are, are any like support groups
Yeah, so
available
there's like
like in the
there's a
area?
couple of Facebook groups that
Okay.
I'm a member of. Don't really post a whole lot
Mm.
myself, but it can be very comforting. Um, I mean, without getting too specific with it, I had a sort of negative experience with the doctor a little while ago, not taking my condition as seriously as they probably should have, and again, some of that is like I'm very fortunate. Like most people, just suffer a lot more than I do, and I acknowledge that. But it was sort of seeing other people say that they had a similar experience with that individual was probably a little helpful for me, and some of my frustration. Um, and again, like I don't even necessarily blame anyone. Like you know, um, doctors are overworked a lot of the time, and especially when you're dealing with sort of a very rare condition, you're getting into all kinds of issues with experience and how to interpret things, and um so like yeah, there are definitely spaces where there are other people, and again it's often very similar. It's often like a sort of diagnosis of last resort. It's one of it's sort of looked at last a lot of the time, um and you know, which again is a problem, because the longer you go out without a diagnosis, the worse potential permanent damage can be
Hmm.
for you. So I will say, like post diagnosis, and even during COVID, as much as difficulty as, for example, that I had with lab result, like things like lab results and getting medication and stuff. Um, Doctors took me really seriously. You know, they if I needed a biopsy or something like that, or if I needed an MRI, I was able to get those relatively quickly, especially given how congested things were for COVID. So I don't want to paint this picture of like sort of being abandoned or not cared about necessarily. but it is this frustrating thing. I mean, like where I mean, like we haven't really touched on this. Like one of the more surreal things about the diagnosis, particularly with respect to the neurological symptoms, was I realized pretty early on in the first few months of treatment that I'd actually been having neurological symptoms for years prior, probably since I was a young boy, that had gone undiagnosed. Um, so like one example, and it is one of those things, sort of talking about like how people can perceive. Again, I'm hesitant to use the word disability, being neuroatypical, or just as being a lack of self character. I used to have terrible handwriting, which is absolutely atrocious. And again, I was told my whole life, you're just not applying yourself. You're not, you're being, maybe not in so many words, but you're being lazy or whatever. And when I went back to school, I remember like, cause I found my old notebooks and I just compared the handwriting, and it was like, no, I was like, it was being caused by the Wilsons. That, like, and it was used, like, I mean, utterly illegible would be the best way to describe it. And now it was very weird where people used to get notes from me in class and they'd be like, oh, you have really nice handwriting. And that was just like a very surreal thing to go through. But sort of two other kind of like weird examples of this was peroxide never used to sting me. Right. So you put peroxide
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, and I was convinced for years that when people said peroxide sting, they were exaggerating or something. It was like, it's kind of those things where maybe I was being a bit heartless myself. And yeah, like one of the first things I noticed was, I cut myself one day and I put peroxide on it. It was like, I couldn't believe how painful it was. And and I was like, oh my God, like like people were exaggerating and the other example would be onions never used to make me cry. And there was one day I'm chopping onions, and again, it was one of those people. It's like, oh, you're exaggerating. It can't be that bad. And yeah, basically every time I chop onions and I tear up now, it's like, yeah, I deserve this. Um, but it is this weird thing where it's like, the peroxide is hurting me, the onion's making me cry, but it's this weird sense of relief and satisfaction I get out of it, knowing that like my body is working in ways that it wasn't before, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they're go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. With what you have gone through over the past years, Helmer, where are you now in terms of with acceptance of this disease? Where are
I
you?
mean,
Because I mean, you actually sound good. You really
yeah,
do.
I mean, I think it's getting back to what I was just saying. Actually, there were so many things about my life that didn't make sense in terms of like difficulties I was having, in terms of um, you know, um, being sick. I mean, like I can remember being a teenager, and again, it's like and it's like being in so much pain, just having horrendous stomach pain. And I tried everything. I tried every elimination diet you could imagine, and nothing seemingly worked. Because who thinks to cutting copper out of their diet? I mean, would that occur to
Mm-hmm.
anyone? Um, and so a lot of the challenges I faced in my life, that again I actually really probably very deeply internalized as me not applying myself as much as I should have, or avoiding things, or being anxious for no reason, or a lot of those things, just like is getting this diagnosis and reading about the symptoms it caused. And again, back to the thing of like, these I'm watching these videos and these people are slurring exactly the way I do. So I think it's not necessarily unusual. And I know I've sort of seen interviews with people with my condition, and sort of read anecdotally, people talking about being in denial about this. But I mean, maybe there's probably it's probably an intersection of several things. One, again, it's sort of like, again, that the point of it made things that didn't make sense in my life make a lot of sense, even besides the illness. But um, it's also that I recovered so much as I did, and that the treatment was so successful initially. And even when I started, when COVID happened and I started facing challenges again, my perspective, the perspective I always try and maintain about it is that, well, again, I'm just extremely lucky. And I think when something bad happens to you, right? Like, and we all have bad things happen to us. And there are
Mm-hmm.
people that, especially as we're having this conversation right now, there are people that are really, really suffering in the world. Um, but whatever your pain is or whatever difficulty you're having, I don't, maybe this is language I don't know how great it's going to be, but I'll frame it like this. You can you have at least an option of making a choice, and you can say, this is going to make me worse. I'm going to use this to feel worse about the world and worse about other people, and to be angry and to take it out on everyone, and be difficult. Or you can say, okay, I'm going to try and take this and use it to make myself a better person. And that's what I hope to do. I mean, I don't know how successful I am, to be perfectly honest, but I think, it's, and it gets back to what you were saying earlier about, like, how does this affect me, or how, if you can honestly say, I'm doing my best under the circumstances, like there's your absolute best, which is your best under ideal conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And I know what that is for me. And again, I'm the kind of person, I'm a real perfectionist. I really strive to do the absolute best I can when I do anything. And it's very, very hard for me to not massively overcommit to in almost any endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
But like, it's sort of giving your permission to say, okay, you know what? There were circumstances that said, like the circumstances were such that it wasn't my absolute best, but it was the best I could do at the time. And I think as long as I can tell myself honestly, um, I am doing the best I can under the circumstances, that doesn't mean I won't be frustrated. It doesn't mean I won't have days where I just,
Mm-hmm.
like, I'm so sick of it. And you know, it also doesn't mean that, like, I can't be angry about it sometimes, or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm losing my train of thought a little bit here. Sorry, but
No, no, that's okay.
the I think, yeah, it's that idea of denial won't help me, but like acknowledging what I have. And again, it's important to understand that the flip side of that, which is like, don't use it as a crutch. Like, don't use it as to say, well, okay, I've got this condition, that means I can just give up now and do nothing, or I don't have to, you know try and apply myself or push myself when it's a little difficult. And again, I think that's probably, about that. There's probably an element of just finding balance in those things. So,
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Now, Helmut, before we
mhm.
close now, do do you have 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 any last words for our listeners, and any message for our
Oh wow.
listeners before we
I
close?
mean, I think so. Before I had my diagnosis, and it was getting pretty dark. Um, and again, it maybe gets back to a little bit of what I was just saying. I kind of said, okay, I am severely limited in what I can do. Um, so what I need to do is trying to figure out what I can do. And I suppose it gets back to something I said much earlier, which is that probably the best way you can cope with any kind of challenge in your life is to focus on the parts of it that you can solve. Or if you can't solve that problem, try and find another problem you can solve. Um, and like, again, like having, like, I feel a bit weird, like coming on here in a sense, in that, like, again, I'm not really exhibiting symptoms or of any kind at this point. Um, but I'm eternally grateful, that I have the opportunity to speak about what happened to me, and to share that experience with people. And like, I mean, like, the sort of generic advice you can give people, which is like, it gets better with time, or like, you find
Mm,
the honest advice I would tell anyone that is suffering for whatever reason. Um, but maybe specifically about, again, because again, having my own experience, is maybe it'll get better, but like it's going to suck at some point, and it's okay to say that. It's okay to say I am suffering and I'm in pain, and that's upsetting to me. And it's sort of, maybe there's this balance of like, it's okay. It's also okay to forgive yourself. Where when you feel like you're not doing as much as you can. And it's also important, maybe you're at times when you're dealing with people that are a little less than nice, and or that aren't taking you seriously, or aren't, whatever. And this is certainly something I experienced myself. That, well, oh, this is so cliched. There's this quote that's attributed to Buddha, which is basically like, being angry with someone else is like poisoning yourself, hoping it'll harm the other person. So I guess my advice to people would be that, it's okay. Again, it gets back to, it's okay to feel angry. It's okay to feel hurt. It's okay to feel frustrated, but just understand that those feelings are also energy. And so if you can figure out a ways of dealing with those feelings so that they don't overwhelm you. And again, that's very easy for me to sit here and say, like, I understand it's not that simple for anyone. But that, getting back to it, focus on things that you can do, whatever it is. And, that's a way of like feeling like you can do things, I guess.
Yeah. It all makes sense, Helmut. It all makes sense. So, on behalf of some sort of law, thank you very much for taking the time to share your story, because we need to create more awareness about Welcome's disease.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll go now, but we will be in touch
okay,
for sure.
Perfect.
Okay. Thanks
Cheers.
again.